Invoking the Holy Spirit with patience, learning to wait for God's gentle work. The invitation to call upon the Holy Spirit with patience reveals a profound spiritual truth. God's most transformative work often unfolds slowly, quietly, and beyond immediate human perception. In a world accustomed to speed, efficiency, and instant results, the call to repeat a prayer slowly and persistently may seem counterintuitive. Yet this practice reflects the very rhythm of the Spirit, who does not force His presence upon the soul, but gently enters when the heart becomes receptive. Repeating the prayer is not an attempt to persuade God, but a way of preparing the human heart to receive what God already desires to give. Patience in prayer is itself an act of faith. It expresses trust that the Holy Spirit is at work even when nothing seems to change. By lingering with the same words, spoken calmly and attentively, the believer learns to remain present, to quiet inner restlessness, and to resist the temptation to control the encounter with God. This patience allows love to descend gradually into the depths of the soul, where wounds, fears, and hidden resistance often lie unnoticed. The Spirit's touch is subtle, but when welcomed patiently, it becomes deeply transformative. This practice also teaches humility. The soul acknowledges that divine transformation cannot be rushed or manipulated. Just as physical healing requires time, so too does spiritual healing. The Holy Spirit respects the mystery of the human heart, entering gently and working progressively. In this patient invocation, the believer learns to surrender expectations and simply remain open, trusting that God's timing is always guided by perfect love. The living flame of love. The Holy Spirit as healing fire. The image of the Holy Spirit as a living flame of love captures both tenderness and power. Fire warms, illuminates, and purifies. Yet it can also be overwhelming if approached without reverence. In the spiritual life, the fire of the Spirit does not destroy, but heals. It enters the deepest center of the soul, where human pain, brokenness, and longing reside, and gently begins the work of restoration. This is not a superficial consolation, but a profound encounter that touches the roots of human suffering. The prayer speaks of the Spirit's soothing wounds. These wounds may come from sin, loss, rejection, fear, or unmet desires. Often they remain hidden beneath layers of distraction or self-protection. The living flame of love does not expose these wounds harshly. Rather, it surrounds them with warmth, allowing the soul to feel safe enough to be healed. Pain does not disappear instantly, but it is transformed from a source of isolation into a place of encounter with God's mercy. This healing fire also restores inner harmony. As the Spirit enters the depths of the soul, disorder gives way to peace. What was fragmented begins to find unity. The believer experiences not the absence of struggle, but a new inner strength that flows from communion with God. In this way, the living flame does not simply remove pain, it integrates it into a greater story of redemption and love, where pain no longer dominates, the Spirit's work of inner freedom. The prayer expresses a hopeful declaration: now pain is no longer. This does not suggest a denial of suffering, but a transformation of its meaning. When the Holy Spirit completes His work according to God's will, pain loses its power to dominate the soul. It no longer defines identity or controls behavior. Instead, it becomes a place where grace is revealed. The Spirit teaches the believer that suffering, when united with divine love, can become a path to deeper freedom. Inner freedom is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of trust. The Holy Spirit leads the soul to rest in God even amid unresolved struggles. This freedom allows the believer to live without being imprisoned by past wounds or future anxieties. As pain is transformed, the heart becomes more available to love, to serve, and to respond generously to God's call. This transformation requires surrender. The Spirit asks for permission to complete His work according to God's design, not human preference. This can be challenging as it involves releasing control and allowing God to lead the process of healing. Yet when the believer consents, a profound peace begins to emerge, a peace rooted not in circumstances, but in communion with God. The true encounter, removing the veil that obscures God's presence. The prayer speaks of removing the veil that blocks a true encounter with God. This veil can take many forms: fear, pride, self-reliance, habitual sin, or distorted images of God. The Holy Spirit gently lifts this veil, not through force, but through love. As the veil dissolves, the soul begins to encounter God, not as an abstract concept, but as a living presence. This true encounter is marked by authenticity. The believer no longer hides behind roles, achievements, or spiritual appearances. In the presence of the Spirit, the soul stands in truth, fragile yet loved, wounded yet chosen. This encounter brings clarity and simplicity, freeing the heart from unnecessary complexity and spiritual pretension. When the veil is removed, prayer becomes less about words and more about presence. Silence becomes meaningful. The soul learns to rest in God, allowing itself to be seen and loved without condition. This encounter is deeply healing, for it restores the soul's original relationship with God, a relationship based on trust, intimacy, and love. Opening the doors to the Spirit, allowing divine guidance. The call to open the doors to the Spirit emphasizes human cooperation in divine transformation. God respects freedom and waits for consent. Opening the doors of the heart is an act of vulnerability, acknowledging that guidance is needed and that self-sufficiency is insufficient. When the believer opens these doors, the Spirit enters not as a distant authority, but as a gentle guide. The Spirit's guidance is not always dramatic. Often it unfolds through small movements, a new awareness, a quiet conviction, a gentle redirection of desire. These subtle promptings shape the believer's path gradually, aligning life more closely with God's will. Trust grows as the soul learns to recognize the Spirit's voice amid daily experiences. This guidance also brings unity between prayer and action. The Spirit does not guide the believer away from the world, but deeper into it, with renewed purpose and love. Daily life becomes the place where divine guidance is lived out, transforming ordinary moments into opportunities for grace. Transformation through the love of the Spirit. The text speaks of becoming new men and women, inspired by the love that the Holy Spirit gives. This newness is not a rejection of one's humanity, but its fulfillment. The Spirit renews the heart, restoring the capacity to love freely and selflessly. Old patterns of fear, resentment, and self-protection gradually lose their hold. This transformation is both personal and communal. As individuals are renewed, relationships are healed, communities are strengthened, and the church becomes a more authentic sign of God's presence. The Spirit's love moves outward, seeking expression through compassion, service, and justice. Newness in the Spirit is marked by joy and freedom. The believer no longer lives primarily from obligation, but from desire, a desire shaped by divine love. This joy does not ignore suffering, but transcends it, rooted in the assurance that God is at work in all things. A church transformed by the Spirit, living witnesses of divine love. The reflection concludes with a vision of a church guided and transformed by the Holy Spirit. When believers open their hearts and allow the Spirit to work patiently and deeply, the church becomes a living testimony of God's love, not through power or prestige, but through humility, compassion, and faithfulness. Christ is made visible in the world. Each transformed life becomes a sign of hope. Through patience in prayer, openness to healing, and willingness to be guided, believers participate in God's ongoing work of renewal. The Holy Spirit continues to shape new hearts, new communities, and new paths of love. In this way, the prayer to the Holy Spirit becomes not only a personal devotion, but a mission to live as people renewed by divine love, bearing witness to a God who heals, transforms, and dwells within his people. The discipline of repetition, allowing the prayer to descend into the soul. The invitation to repeat the prayer slowly and many times is not a matter of technique, but of spiritual discipline rooted in trust. Repetition in prayer allows words to descend from the surface of the mind into the depths of the soul, where true transformation takes place. At first, the words may feel external, even mechanical, yet with patience they begin to take root, shaping inner awareness and opening spaces long closed by distraction or fear. This gradual descent is the work of the Holy Spirit, who uses repetition not to exhaust the soul, but to quiet it. In repeating the prayer, the believer learns to remain present. Modern life trains the mind to move quickly, to seek novelty, and to avoid silence. The discipline of repetition resists this tendency, teaching the soul to dwell rather than to rush. Each repetition becomes an act of consent, a renewed yes to God's presence. Over time, the prayer ceases to be something the believer recites. It becomes something the believer inhabits. This process also reveals inner resistance. As the prayer is repeated, thoughts, memories, and emotions surface, some comforting, others unsettling. These distractions are not obstacles, but invitations. They reveal the areas of the heart that need healing, surrender, or deeper trust. The Holy Spirit uses the prayer as a gentle light, illuminating what lies beneath the surface without judgment or haste. Through faithful repetition, the soul is gradually shaped by what it contemplates. The image of the living flame, the request for healing, and the desire for God's will begin to influence the believer's inner landscape. The prayer becomes a place of encounter where God works patiently and quietly, forming the heart according to divine love. The night of transformation, trusting the Spirit when God feels absent. As the prayer deepens, there may come moments when God feels distant or silent. The warmth of consolation may fade, leaving behind a sense of dryness or emptiness. This experience, often described by the spiritual tradition as a night, is not a sign of failure or abandonment. Rather, it is frequently a sign that the Holy Spirit is working at a deeper level, beyond emotion and perception. The prayer of patience prepares the soul precisely for this stage. In this night, the believer learns to trust without relying on feeling. The Holy Spirit invites the soul to remain faithful, even when prayer feels unproductive or burdensome. This fidelity purifies love, freeing it from dependence on consolation and anchoring it in trust. The soul begins to love God for who He is, not for what He gives. This transition is subtle but profound, marking a significant step towards spiritual maturity. The living flame of love continues to burn even when it is no longer felt. Beneath the surface, the Spirit is healing attachments, reshaping desires, and deepening humility. The prayer, repeated patiently, becomes an act of surrender and acknowledgement that God's work is hidden but real. In this surrender, the soul finds a new kind of peace, quieter and more stable than emotional reassurance. This night also fosters compassion. Having experienced vulnerability and limitation, the believer becomes more gentle with others. Judgment gives way to understanding, and impatience gives way to mercy. The Spirit uses the night not only to transform the individual, but to prepare the heart for deeper communion with others and more authentic service in the world. Silence as communion, resting in the presence of the Holy Spirit. As the prayer matures, words gradually give way to silence. This silence is not emptiness, but fullness, a space where the soul rests in the presence of the Holy Spirit without the need to explain, request, or control. Having repeated the prayer many times, the believer no longer clings to the words themselves, but to the presence they reveal. Silence becomes a form of communion, where God and the soul meet beyond language. In this silent communion, the Spirit completes His work gently and discreetly. Healing continues, not through dramatic intervention, but through sustained presence. The soul learns to remain before God as it is, without pretense or defense. This vulnerability allows divine love to penetrate more deeply, touching places words could never reach. Silence also transforms perception. The believer begins to recognize God's presence not only in prayer, but throughout daily life. Ordinary moments are infused with quiet meaning. Work, relationships, and even suffering become places of encounter. The Spirit teaches the soul to listen, not only during prayer, but in every aspect of life. From this silence emerges a renewed way of living. Actions become more deliberate, speech more measured, and relationships more compassionate. The believer carries the silence within, allowing it to shape responses to the world. In this way, the prayer of patient invocation bears fruit beyond the prayer itself, transforming the whole of life into a response to divine love. Invoking the Holy Spirit with patience, a life transformed by divine love. The journey of patiently invoking the Holy Spirit leads the believer into the deepest mystery of the spiritual life, transformation through divine love that unfolds in silence, time, and surrender. Throughout this reflection, we have seen that the Spirit does not rush, impose, or overwhelm. Instead, He waits for the heart to open, for the soul to consent, and for trust to replace control. In a world that values immediacy, this patient invocation becomes a countercultural act of faith, a declaration that God's work is more profound than anything that can be forced or hurried. By repeating the prayer slowly and attentively, the believer learns to dwell rather than to demand, to listen rather than to speak, and to trust rather than to grasp. This repetition is not empty or redundant, it is formative. It allows the words of the prayer to sink beneath the surface, shaping the inner life and preparing the soul for the gentle touch of the Spirit. Over time, the prayer becomes less about what is said and more about what is received, a quiet openness to the living flame of love. The image of the Holy Spirit as a healing fire reveals the heart of this journey. The Spirit enters the deepest center of the soul, where wounds are hidden and pain has shaped identity. There, He does not accuse or condemn, but soothes, restores, and integrates. Pain does not simply vanish, it is transformed. What once isolated the soul becomes a place of encounter with mercy. What once defined the self gives way to a new identity rooted in being loved by God. As the Spirit completes His work according to God's will, the believer discovers a new freedom. Fear loosens its grip. Old patterns of resistance fade. The soul becomes more spacious, more receptive, more capable of love. This freedom is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of trust, a trust that remains even when God seems silent, even in the night of faith. In this night, purified love is born, a love that no longer depends on consolation but rests securely in God alone. The removal of the inner veil marks a turning point in this journey. When fear, pride, and self-reliance are gently lifted, the soul encounters God in truth. Prayer becomes presence. Silence becomes communion. The believer no longer strives to appear faithful, but simply allows themselves to be seen and loved. In this simplicity, the heart finds rest. From this encounter flows a renewed way of living. Guided by the Holy Spirit, the believer becomes a new person, not through self-improvement, but through transformation. Love becomes the primary motivation. Compassion replaces judgment. Patience replaces urgency. The Spirit shapes the believer into a living witness of divine love, not through extraordinary acts, but through ordinary faithfulness. Ultimately, this patient invocation of the Holy Spirit is not a moment, but a way of life. It forms a heart that listens, a soul that trusts, and a life that reflects Christ. Through patience, the believer learns to cooperate with grace, allowing God to accomplish what only God can do. In this way, the prayer becomes both the path and the destination, a continual opening of the heart to the living flame of love that renews all things. Prayer. A prayer of patient invocation to the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, living flame of eternal love, we come before you in silence, aware of our poverty and trusting in your gentle power. We invoke you with patience, not because you are distant, but because our hearts are often restless. Teach us to wait, to remain, and to trust that you are already at work, even when we do not feel your presence. O living flame, enter the deepest center of our souls. Touch the places we hide, the wounds we fear to name, the pain that still shapes our thoughts and choices. Do not overwhelm us, but warm us slowly, until fear gives way to trust and brokenness becomes a place of healing. Soothe every wound, seen and unseen. Calm the memories that still ache. Heal the fears that imprison our hearts. Let your love flow gently where resistance remains, until pain no longer dominates and peace begins to take root. Holy Spirit, complete your work in us according to the will of the Father. Remove every veil that prevents a true encounter with God, the veil of pride, the veil of self-sufficiency, the veil of fear and false images of love. Lead us into truth, where we may stand before God as we truly are, fragile, beloved, and called. Teach us the grace of silence. When words fall away, remain with us. When prayer feels dry, strengthen our fidelity. When the night of faith surrounds